ready for the word? Genesis 14. This morning we're going to deal with the first 16 verses. Genesis 14. We'll begin reading in verse 1. It came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar. Shinar is another name for Babylon. We'd want to say Arioch. I think actually in the Hebrew it's Arioch, the king of Elasar. Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, title king of nations. That these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemabir, king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the salt sea. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer. In the 13th year they rebelled. So 12 years they had been paying tribute to the nation of Elam and its king. In the 13th year they rebelled. So when they did, the king of Elam is going to gather allies and come to bring them back into submission. But I want you to notice what he and his allies had to contend with before they could go after the 5 nations that had rebelled. Their purpose of gathering together is to come make the 5 nations that had rebelled come back into submission. But they had to deal with something else before they could, so pay attention to what they had to deal with in verse 5. And in the 14th year came Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims and Ham, and the Emims and Shaveh Kirathim, and the Horites in their Mount Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. So this is a list of tribes that they had to smite, it says, before they were able to do battle with Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Now look closely at who it says they smote. Do any of those names or those groups of people sound familiar to you? Yes? What sounds familiar about it? Say again? Nephilim, giants, hybrids. Keep your finger there. We're going to come back and finish reading that, but go to Deuteronomy Chapter 2 for just a moment. Deuteronomy Chapter 2, look at verse 10. The Emims, mentioned in Genesis 14, mentioned here in Deuteronomy 2. The Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many, and tall as an Anakim. The Bible tells us, I think in the book of Amos, how tall the Anakim were. Anybody remember how tall it says they would get? As tall as the cedars of Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon can grow up to 36 feet tall. Remember in Numbers chapter 13 when the spies came back, 10 spies gave an evil report of the land, and they said, we saw the children of Anak there. Anakim. We saw the children of Anak there, and we were what? We looked like grasshoppers in their sight. We were as grasshoppers in their sight. So the Anakim were a huge people. It says here in Deuteronomy 2 that the Emims were as tall as the Anakim. Verse 11, which also were accounted as giants, and actually that word translated giants is the same word in Genesis 14 that's translated as Rephaim. So they were accounted Rephaim as the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emims. So Rephaim, Anakims, Emims, sometimes the names got mixed up, but it was all referring to Nephilim and hybrid beings. Look in verse 19 of Deuteronomy 2. And when you come nigh over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them, for I will not give thee of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I have given it unto the children of Lot for possession. That also was accounted a land of giants. Giants dwelt therein in old time, and the Ammonites called them Zamzumims. or Zemines. All right? So when you go back to Genesis 14, which you can do now if you will, when you go back to Genesis 14, you see a list of some of the same tribes listed in Deuteronomy 2. And Deuteronomy 2 tells us that these people were as tall as the children of Anak, which were extremely big. So it lists, first of all, Raphaim. The word Raphaim refers to invigorated giants. We'd call them walking dead. Ashtaroth, does that name sound familiar? Who's Ashtaroth? Ishtar, same thing, exactly. Ishtar. The word Karnaim means the double power or the double-horned one. So here's Ishtar, the double-horned one. That's not a good image, is it? No. All right, then you got the Zuzims, which we read about in Deuteronomy 2, the Emims, which we read about, and the Horites. Today we'd call the Horites the troglodytes. That's all that Horites means. It means a cave dweller. Cave dweller. You know, school would have you believe that we came from cavemen. That's not so. There were cavemen. But you and I are not a descendant of them. They were not fully human. They were hybrids. They were savages. If you want to know something about who the Horites were, go do some research on the giant of Kandahar. 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 A recent encounter with a Horite type creature by our U.S. military. We're in Genesis 14, look in verse 7. And they returned and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazazon-Tamar. So Amalekites and Amorites, all of these 7 tribes listed are hybrids. They came from the Nephilim. They came from the incursion in Genesis 6. Only what I want you to notice here in Genesis 14 was it was only after these 7 tribes were defeated that the 5 kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar had to be faced by the king of Elam. The king of Elam had to deal with those 7 tribes before he could deal with Sodom and Gomorrah. Now in 2019, we spent several weeks searching Torah concerning the incursion that happened in Genesis 6. And I am not now at this time going to do another study on the fallen ones, on the Nephilim, on the hybrids, or the demon spirits that came forth from them. But I do want to point out that Genesis 6 gives vital information about an incursion that occurred that greatly altered life on earth. And if you ignore the information given in Genesis 6, then you'll find yourself confused or lost when studying other portions of Torah. Genesis 6 says there were giants in the earth in those days and also after that. And so here we are several hundred years after the flood, and the king of Elam and his allies are having to deal with 7 tribes of giants before he can go and deal with Sodom and Gomorrah, which is his main goal. But he can't deal with them till he deals with these hybrids. All right? These 7 tribes have something to do with military conflict between 11 different nations. And I don't know what role they played. I wish Genesis 14 gave us more information. I don't know what role they played. All I know is that when I read the text, the king of Elam left to go bring Sodom and Gomorrah and the other 3 back into submission, but he couldn't do that until he dealt with the 7 tribes of giants. It is clear that Sodom and the nations aligned with them could not be attacked until those 7 tribes were dealt with. It's interesting when you read the book of Enoch to discover 3 primary things that the fallen ones taught mankind that angered Yahweh. 3, they intruded in a lot of ways. But the 3 main things that they taught mankind that angered Yahweh was, number one, they taught mankind the power of seduction. Number two, they taught them how to produce alcohol. And number three, they taught them how to make weapons of war. Worthless knowledge, Yahweh called it. Years ago, when I first moved to North Alabama, that would have been 2001, I went up to tour the Jack Daniels facility where they make their whiskey. It's not far from here, 45 minutes, an hour from here. The process by which they make that whiskey is bewildering to me. The guide that took us on the tour was explaining all the different processes they had to go through in order to produce what you and I call whiskey or bourbon. And as I went through this tour and I watched and listened to everything he was explaining, I said to Marie, how did they come up with this? How did they come up with this process? It's not logical. It's not like, oh, if we did this, we could do this. If we did this, we could do this. There's nothing logical about the process by which they make whiskey. It's a strange process. Well, who came up with it, and how did they know to do it that way? The answer to that question didn't come to me until many years later when I read the book of Enoch. The fallen ones taught men how to do that. Why do you think that hard liquor is called spirits? You'll still see stores around sometimes that sell spirits. Because mankind knows that's where the formula came from. Spirits taught men how to do it. Enoch said they also taught men and women the power of seduction, which led to sexual immorality. And they also taught them how to make weapons of war. Well, take that information and use it here in Genesis 14. Here you have 4 kings coming to do battle with Sodom and Gomorrah. Before they can, they have to defeat 7 tribes of hybrids. They're not just 7 other nations in the area. Torah makes it plain that these 7 tribes are hybrids created by the incursion that we read about in Genesis 6. Now think about what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah. Were they a nation of righteous men and women? No. Genesis 13, we just finished studying that. Genesis 13:13 says, the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before Yahweh exceedingly. So it shouldn't surprise us that when we're reading about them, that associated with them are these hybrid beings listed in Genesis 14. Now Sodom gets singled out in Genesis 13:13 as being exceedingly wicked, but it's singled out only because that's where Lot pitched his tent. The others are just as wicked as Sodom is. Gomorrah is just as wicked, and Zeboim is just as wicked. The other 3 are just as wicked. So when you put all this together, it's easy to conclude that Sodom and Gomorrah were heavily influenced by those hybrids and the demon spirits that are connected to them. In Sodom and Gomorrah, you have sexual perversion and you have warfare. Where did all of this initiate? Where was it initiated? It was initiated by these hybrids that they learned it from. Major things taught by the fallen ones are very prominent in Sodom and Gomorrah. I was listening to this past week, I think it was, I was listening to a seminary professor on YouTube, and he has given his opinion on why we should not read the book of Enoch. His primary reason was the book of Enoch, he said, put too much emphasis on the role of the fallen ones, too much emphasis on the role they played on introducing sin, and not enough condemnation upon mankind itself. He did not like the fact that in the book of Enoch there is a judgment from heaven that says to Azazel, upon him ascribe all sin. He didn't like that. He said it removes too much responsibility and too much guilt from mankind. He said mankind needs to be responsible for their own sin. Well, his position, in my opinion, is absurd. Yeah, the soul that sins, it shall die, but to ignore that there was an incursion in Genesis 6 that led to transgression so great that the earth had to be destroyed by a flood, that Yahweh had to do something that drastic to preserve his bloodline, is a foolish thing to do. To ignore that is a foolish thing to do. Absolutely, man sinned, and because they have sinned, they need a Messiah to rescue them. But that does not negate the fact that they were heavily influenced by some mighty beings from the heavenly realm. And those mighty beings from the heavenly realm also have to be dealt with. The wickedness that is rampant in the earth exceeds, it is greater than just the wickedness of men. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. It's not flesh and blood that is the main cause of the horrors that you see taking place on the earth today. The horrors that you see taking place in any generation, and that includes today, are caused primarily by principalities, by powers, by rulers of the darkness of this world, by spiritual wickedness in the heavenlies. Amen. That incursion in Genesis 6 was an incursion of some very powerful beings. They were not just some angels who came down. They were the Ben Ha-Elohim. They were the sons of God. They are mighty beings that came down in that incursion of Genesis 6. And their influence is not to be underestimated, okay? When these hybrids, they procreated with women, they created some hybrid beings who had great height and supernatural powers. And when these hybrids died, what happened to their souls? They had nowhere to go. They cannot go into the bosom of Abraham. They cannot go into paradise. They cannot go into Sheol. Yahweh will not allow it. And so they're left to roam the earth. They are contained in the earth. All right? So in the earth, you still have hybrids at work, and you have demon spirits, which are the spirits of hybrids who have died at work. They can create a lot of horrific things. And where they work, you can be assured that three primary things are going to take place. Drug and alcohol will be rampant. Sexual perversion will be embraced, and weapons of war and warfare are going to thrive. Wherever there are hybrids and demon spirits at work, those three things are going to be seen. Okay? So when you look at our world today and you see pedophilia and child abduction taking place, and you wonder how in the world a human could do such a thing, the answer is it's being spearheaded by those who are not fully human. There are people walking the earth today that you wouldn't know it by looking at them, but they are hybrids. And they're at work in the earth. And then humans get sucked into it, and under the influence of these demonic spirits also do some horrific things such as pedophilia and child abduction. But understand, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. There are other powers at work out there as well. It's heart-wrenching to know that so many evangelicals take the position of that seminary professor and want to cast out the book of Enoch. To cast it aside because you think that it wants to absolve humans of their guilt is a grave mistake. It's not wanting to absolve us of our guilt. It's wanting us to make us aware of our enemies in the earth. And it makes those enemies clearly visible to us. So, protect yourself from them. And here's what I mean when I say protect yourself from them. Beware of spirits and pharmaceuticals. Legal or illegal. And beware of seduction. Once those spirits pull people in by these inroads, then a society becomes exceedingly wicked and war ensues. It's just that simple. Let's continue reading in Genesis 14. We'll move on to verse 8. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the valley of Siddim. With Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, the king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the valley of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. How much goods did Lot have? A lot. Genesis 13:6 says his substance was great. There came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. From these verses, allow me to make 3 quick points this morning. Point number 1. Tribute is tyrannical. A tyrant is a cruel, oppressive person. So to be tyrannical is to be oppressive and controlling. We're told in verse 4, 12 years they served this king of Elam, and in the 13th year they rebelled. To serve means to work for or to toil. They worked producing goods for 12 years. They worked creating income for 12 years, and the king of Elam confiscated great portions of it for his own consumption. He would have called it tribute. They would pay him a tribute, but he's confiscating. He forced them to pay this tribute. We'd call it what? Taxes. Same thing. Now, when a tyrant confiscates goods, he always convinces the people that he's confiscating it from that it's for their own good, that they will benefit from it. But tribute is always tyrannical. Tribute is forced on people by oppressive leaders. If something is for our own good, we gladly pay to receive it. Yeah. If something is for our own good, money doesn't have to be confiscated from us for us to partake of it. We will pay for it. But tyrants like to decide for us what's good for us, and then confiscate whatever amount they decide they want to confiscate in order to provide that good that they want us to have. Sometimes people rebel against the confiscation of their income, and they're successful. 1776. Sometimes they stay too long under the oppressive tyrant and stray too far away from Yahweh, and then they rebel and they're not successful. See Genesis chapter 14. Keep this in mind. No matter how much the king of Elam said that it was beneficial for Sodom and Gomorrah to be under his rule, he had no regard for them whatsoever, no matter how much he may have said he did. His only desire was to confiscate their income. You look in verse 11, it makes it plain. In verse 11, and they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, all their victuals, and went their way. That's what he wanted to begin with. At first he was just taking a portion. Now he takes it all. It's always about getting the money. Always. No government project that required raising your taxes was ever started to benefit you. Any government project that required raising of taxes was started to confiscate money. Tribute is always tyrannical. When it's confiscated from you, taken from you without your approval, it's tyrannical. Tyrants are involved. When they can vote to take away more and more of what you produce, you're serving them as a slave. A government of the people, for the people, by the people has been hijacked and is in danger of falling when tyrants are allowed to confiscate people's income by a vote. Tribute is tyrannical. Point number 2. Training is biblical. Abraham heard about what had happened to Lot, and he was prepared to do something about it because in his household were 318 trained servants. Trained for what?
Battle.
Trained for battle. Trained for war. Prepared for what? Prepared for war. Look at that verse again, 14:14. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants. When he heard, he moved. When he heard, he moved. And now look at that phrase, he armed his trained servants. Now when we read that phrase in English, we think that what he did is gave them swords, right? Or something, gave them some weapon. But that's not what the verse actually says. That's not what the Hebrew actually said. The word translated armed is ruk, R-U-Q or R-O-O-K. Ruk means to empty out, or to pour out, or to pull out. It's used in reference to a man emptying his money bag. He will ruk it. He empties it. It's used in reference to a man who's got a sword in a sheath. He will pull it out. Well, yeah, now he's armed, but this word doesn't mean to be armed. It's a reference to the act of pulling it out. So look at what Abram did. It said when he heard about Lot, he armed his trained ones. Here's what it actually says. It's not like Abraham pulled out his sword or picked up swords and handed it to some guys. When Abraham heard what had happened, he pulled out 318 men and said, "Oh, no, you're not." He didn't have to go get them armed and ready. They were already armed, as we understand the word armed. They were already armed and ready. He just pulled them out and used them for the task at hand. He could do that because he had some. He couldn't have pulled them out if he didn't have them. You can't draw a sword unless you have a sword. You can't pull a gun unless you have a gun. You can't pull out 318 trained servants unless you have 318 trained servants. All right? So, training is biblical. Being prepared is biblical. Pray for peace, prepare for war. General Storman Norman Schwarzkopf said, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. Prepping is not a lack of faith. Prepping is not an activity of the flesh. Prepping is biblical. We should be trained to defend our families. A locked door does not mean that we hate the people outside the door. It means that we love the people behind the door. A loaded weapon does not mean I hate the people who are threatening me. It means that I'm responsible for the people behind me. Training is biblical. It is written in Romans 12:18, if it be possible, as much as lies in you, live peaceably with all men. Absolutely. You agree? Yes. Live peaceably with all men. But listen to the verse. If it be possible. If you wish to mandate that my children be taught CRT and the flexibility of sexual identity, then it is no longer possible for me to live at peace with you. If you wish to mandate that I have to take a jab that I do not need and I do not want, then it is no longer possible for me to live at peace with you. If you wish to make my votes irrelevant by manipulating voting machines, it's no longer possible for me to live at peace with you. If you wish to continue to pass laws that increase the amount of my income that you confiscate from me, then it's no longer possible for me to live at peace with you. Abraham is not, get this now, Abraham was not defending Torah. Abraham was defending a member of the family. We need to cleanse ourselves of passivity.
That's true.
Yahweh put His approval upon what Abraham did by giving Abraham the victory. Understand, Abraham went to war against 4 kings who had just defeated 7 tribes of hybrid beings, giants. And these 4 kings then defeated 5 nations. Abraham, with 318 men, attacked those 4 kings and their armies and defeated them. Yahweh put His stamp of approval upon what that man had done. If Yahweh be for us, who can be against us? But know this. Until we stand up against those who are against us, we will never see that Yahweh is for us.
That's true.
It's just something embroidered that we hang on the wall. But we never see the reality of it until we stand up against those who are against us. So training is biblical. Be prepared at all times and pray that you never have to use your training. Yes. Number 3, tenaciousness is necessary. And this is just a continuation of the thought I just shared when I said until we stand up against those who are against us, we'll never see that Yahweh's for us. To be tenacious means to be a person who will not easily give up a position, a principle, or a course of action. You know, we see the gentler side, the softer side of Abram when he was buying that cave for the burial of Sarah. And we see this gentler, softer side of Abram when he said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between us. You choose the right, I'll go to the left. You choose the left, I'll go to the right." This is a meek, easy to deal with kind of man. But in chapter 14, we see a tenacious Abraham. He's not going to allow Lot and his goods to be stolen. He didn't wait on a word from heaven. He didn't wait until he got a vision. He didn't wait until there was a dream. He didn't call his friends and say, "Hey, we need to start a prayer chain for my nephew. I need prayer warriors." It's not what he did. He pulled out 318 trained men. He emptied out his trained servants on that situation immediately. Verse 14 says, when he had heard, that's when he acted. As soon as he heard, he goes into action. No delay. I think sometimes we use prayer as an excuse to keep from doing what we know needs to be done. Sometimes we tell people we'll pray for them when we should instead go sit with them and comfort them. Sometimes we tell people we'll pray for them when we should instead pull out a wallet and assist them. Sometimes we want to fold our hands in prayer when we should instead lift our hands to aid, to comfort, to do battle, or to protest. We need tenacity in our bloodstreams again. Abraham had it, David had it, Elijah had it, Yeshua had it, Peter had it, Paul had it. Actually, every man who was ever mightily used by Yahweh had tenacity. They were men of action who were not easily moved from their principles or their decisions. Yahweh will never show himself mighty on behalf of those who quietly relinquish their faith. He'll never show himself mighty on behalf of those who quietly give up their rights. He'll never show himself mighty on behalf of those who quietly just do what they're told to do. True. But when we stand, we'll find his hand mighty to deliver. We need more tenacity and less timidity. We need more backbone and less jawbone. That is, less talking and more doing. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. And because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, it requires that we're trained and tenacious if we're going to walk in victory. We live in a hostile environment. That requires that we be trained and tenacious. We strive to live peaceably with all men where it's possible. But if they make it impossible, we need to be trained. And we need to be tenacious to prevent them from imposing godly mandates upon our life. I'll close by saying this. If we're truly Torah-minded, if truly our thought processes were formed by Torah instead of by the world, if we were truly Torah-minded, we would understand without a doubt that masculinity is not toxic.
That's true.
It's a characteristic that Yahweh uses to defeat evil. Hallelujah. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. As his name is put upon you, so shall he himself bless you.